There's a particular kind of mistake that looks like wisdom while you're making it. It wears the costume of being responsible. It sounds, in your own head, like good sense. And it can cost you the best thing that was ever going to happen to you, and you won't even know you're making it until years later, looking back, wondering how you almost let arithmetic talk you out of love. This is a story about exactly that kind of mistake, and about a woman who refused to let a man make it. Margaret Hale was 25 years old, and she had lived on the property next to the Callaway Ranch her entire life. She knew that land the way she knew her own hands the creak of the gate, the lean of the old barn, the way morning light hit the mountains to the west and turned everything briefly gold for a few minutes before settling into an ordinary day. She also knew Thomas Callaway, 55 years old, a widower, the kind of man that a hard life makes either bitter or quiet. Thomas had chosen quiet. He worked his land, kept his word, and had spent 3 years learning how to live in a house built for 2 people when there was only 1 person left in it. She had been bringing him food since his wife passed. Not out of pity, out of the particular kind of care you offer someone you've watched carry something heavy for a long time without ever asking for help. On a Tuesday morning in early autumn, she brought him an apple pie. He looked at it, then at her, and then he smiled the rare smile, the one that changed his whole face. "If only I were 10 years younger," he said. He meant it as a joke. A small, harmless thing, the kind of line men say to soften a feeling they don't want to name. She looked at him with an expression he didn't know how to read. Because for Margaret, it wasn't a joke at all. His late wife had died 2 years earlier, slowly, the way illnesses take their time when they intend to be thorough. Thomas had sat with her through the whole of it, and when it was finished, he buried her under the cottonwood tree east of the house and went back to work the next morning, because work was the only thing that still made sense to him. That was the story people in town told about Thomas afterward, that he went back to work the very next day. Some said it with admiration. Some said it with worry. Thomas himself had no real opinion about it. He simply hadn't known what else to do with himself. Margaret had known his late wife well. Their families had been neighbors for 30 years, and her presence had made the whole area feel less like scattered properties and more like a community. When she died, something in the place went quiet that had always been warm. Margaret started bringing food 2 weeks after the funeral. Not every day she had her own 40 acres to run and her full attention it required, especially since her parents had relocated to be closer to her sister. Just on Tuesdays. A pot of something, a loaf of bread, or a pie when the apples were good. Thomas always responded the same way. "You didn't have to do this." And Margaret always gave the same answer. "I know." They repeated this exchange so many times over 3 years that it became its own private shorthand, a conversation neither of them looked at too closely, because looking at it closely meant admitting what it actually was. Here's the first thing worth taking from this story, and it applies far outside of any ranch in Colorado. Consistency says more than declarations ever will. Anyone can say nice words once. Far fewer people show up, quietly and without asking for credit, week after week, for years. If you want to know what someone actually thinks of you, don't listen to what they say in a single conversation. Watch what they keep doing, unprompted, long after it would have been easy to stop. What Thomas noticed over those 3 years of Tuesdays was that Margaret was extraordinarily capable. She ran her property alone, without complaint, and without ever asking for help she didn't actually need. She mended her own fences. She negotiated her own cattle prices at market and consistently got better rates than men twice her experience, because she did her research and knew exactly what things were worth before she ever opened her mouth to bargain. She was also, he had noticed and then immediately tried to stop noticing, remarkably easy to be around. The conversation on his porch was always good. She had opinions and offered them without apology. She laughed at things he said that he hadn't even been sure were funny. She asked about his cattle and actually listened to the answers, instead of waiting for her turn to talk. He had filed all of this carefully under the heading of good neighbor. It was a safe category. It required nothing further from him. He fully intended to leave her there, indefinitely. That plan held right up until the Tuesday morning she arrived with the apple pie. He made his joke. And she looked at him the way she looked at him, and the category began, quietly and without his permission, to fall apart. The town had opinions about Margaret. This wasn't unusual. It was a growing town, energized by a recent railroad line and the particular self-importance of any place that believes it's on its way to becoming something bigger. And growing towns always have opinions, especially about young women who run their own land and don't seem to need rescuing. The opinion that concerned Margaret most involved a young man named Daniel. He was 28, the son of the town's most prosperous merchant, handsome in the practiced way of men who've always known they were handsome. He'd been making his interest in her clear since the previous spring, not aggressively. He was too polished for that. He brought small gifts. He showed up at the market on the days she sold cattle. He said the right things in the right tone. The town approved of him enthusiastically. He was young, he was prosperous, and he would, people agreed, make an excellent husband for a woman who was lovely and capable, but was clearly going to wear herself out running that property alone if somebody didn't intervene. One of the shopkeepers told Margaret directly, "He's a good man. You could do considerably worse." Margaret thanked her, bought her flour, and said nothing else. Her friend Ruth, freshly married and therefore newly self-appointed as an expert on the subject, was more pointed about it. "He's asked about you 3 times this month." 3 times, Margaret. At what point do you give the man a chance? When I want to, Margaret said pleasantly. And when will that be? Margaret looked out at the mountains. Always there, always reliable, always exactly themselves. I don't know, she said, which wasn't entirely true. She had a fairly clear sense of when she intended to give Daniel a real chance, and the honest answer was approximately never. The reason for that answer was something she wasn't ready to say out loud yet, because saying it out loud would make it real, and real things come with consequences. She'd made the pie on Monday evening, using good apples from the tree at the south end of her land, the ones that ripen sweet in September. She made the crust the way her mother had taught her. Cold butter, cold hands. Don't overwork the dough. She crimped the edges carefully. She would later admit to herself that she'd been more careful than the occasion strictly required. This is worth pausing on, because it's a small, practical truth that applies well beyond pie crust. The amount of care someone puts into a small, ordinary task often reveals more about how they feel than anything they're willing to say directly. Watch the effort, not just the words. She carried the pie across the field under a sky doing what autumn skies do in that part of the country, an almost unreasonable blue, the kind that makes everything beneath it look like it belongs in a painting. Thomas was on the porch when she arrived, the way he usually was on Tuesday mornings, as if he'd learned the rhythm of her visits without ever admitting to himself that he had. He was drinking coffee and looking at the mountains with the stillness of a man who'd made some kind of peace with mornings. She came up the steps and held out the pie. He looked at it with genuine appreciation. He was a man who understood the value of a well-made pie, which Margaret had always privately counted in his favor. "Apple," he said. "September apples," she said. "The good ones." He looked at the pie, then at her, then smiled the rare smile. The one that arrived slowly and changed his whole face, the one that made him look briefly like a younger version of himself. "If only I were 10 years younger," he said lightly, the way people say things meant to land softly and then move along. Margaret looked at him. The morning held them both. A hawk circled overhead. The mountains did what mountains do. 10 years wouldn't be enough, she said. And before he could fully process that, she set the pie on the porch railing, said she had cattle to check, and walked back across the field. Thomas stood there a long time, looking at the pie, then at her retreating figure, then at the pie again. Eventually he went inside, poured more coffee, sat at his kitchen table, and thought about what she'd said for the rest of the day, and honestly, for considerably longer than that. Daniel arrived at Margaret's property that Wednesday with flowers, not wildflowers, arranged ones, the kind that come from a shop, which meant he'd ordered them in advance from the city, which meant this had been planned. Margaret accepted them with the same warmth she gave most things, alongside the very specific internal reaction of a woman who knows exactly what shop-bought flowers mean and isn't sure how to address it without being unkind. She put them in water. She offered coffee. Daniel sat at her table with the comfortable ease of a man accustomed to being welcome, and told her about his father's new supply contract. Substantial, he noted, with the modest pride of someone who wants you to register his success without appearing to want it. He wasn't, she acknowledged privately, a bad man. He was pleasant, prosperous, and in every practical sense an entirely reasonable choice. The town wasn't wrong about that much. He asked if he could escort her to the harvest social at the end of the month. "I'll think about it," she said, kind enough, honest enough, and it bought her time she wasn't sure what to do with. After he left, she stood at her window looking out toward the Callaway Ranch. Late afternoon light sat on the mountains. The barn threw a long shadow across the gold grass. Somewhere out there, Thomas was doing whatever Thomas did in the late afternoon, which she knew, because she'd been paying attention for 3 years, usually meant checking the north fence line. She thought about what she'd said to him, and whether she was being foolish, and whether being foolish actually mattered. After a long while at that window, she decided it mattered considerably less than she'd previously assumed. Thomas was not a man who processed things quickly. He was thorough. Careful, he turned things over the way you turn soil completely, examining what's underneath before deciding what to do with it. He turned 10 years wouldn't be enough over in his mind for roughly 2 weeks. In that time, he fixed the north fence, moved the cattle to winter pasture, repaired the barn roof, and had 3 one-sided conversations with his elderly horse about the nature of things that arrive when you weren't expecting them. The horse's contributions were limited, but his attention seemed sincere. On the 14th day, Thomas rode into town for supplies and heard, secondhand, that Daniel had asked Margaret to the harvest social, and that she'd said she'd think about it, which the town had unanimously decided was practically a yes. Thomas bought his supplies. He rode home. He put his horse away. He sat on the porch where he'd made his joke, looked at the railing where she'd left the pie, and thought about a woman who had crossed that field every Tuesday for 3 years and never once asked for anything in return. He thought about his late wife, not with guilt, but with the memory of a woman who'd had profound good sense, and who had told him more than once that stubbornness pointed in the wrong direction was just stupidity wearing better posture. He was fairly certain he knew exactly what she would have said about his current situation. Here's the second practical lesson worth carrying out of this story. The things that feel like virtue's caution. Humility. Being realistic can sometimes be fear wearing a respectable disguise. There's a difference between genuine wisdom and simply being too scared to risk disappointment. Thomas had spent 2 weeks calling his hesitation responsibility. It wasn't. It was fear doing arithmetic. He went inside and looked at himself in the small mirror by the kitchen door, the gray hair, the lines, 55 years of weather on his face, and had the specific kind of conversation with his own reflection that a man has when his better judgment has already made up its mind and he's just catching up to it. His better judgment won. He put on his hat and walked across the field. She was mending the south fence when he arrived, not stepping onto her land, but stopping right at the fence line between their two properties, technically neutral ground. He put his hands on the top rail and looked at her with the expression of a man who had decided something and was committing to it. She kept working. She'd learned over 3 years that Thomas said things in his own time, and that waiting was more efficient than pushing. "Margaret," he said. "Thomas," she said without looking up, "I've been thinking about what you said." "Which thing?" "You know which thing." She set down her tool and looked at him. 10 years wouldn't be enough, he said. "I've been thinking about what that meant." "And what did you conclude?" He was quiet a moment. The afternoon held them both, the mountains, the gold grass, the particular quality of autumn light that makes everything look real and like a memory at the same time. "I concluded," he said carefully, "that I don't know what you meant, and that I'd like to." He looked down at the fence rail. "I'm 55. I know what that means and what it doesn't. I'm not going to pretend it's nothing." He looked back up at her. "But I'd like to know, if you're willing to tell me." She looked at this careful, quiet, thoroughly decent man who had spent 3 years accepting her Tuesdays without ever once asking why she kept showing up. "It meant," she said, "that 10 years wouldn't make you any more of what I was looking for, because you're already exactly what I was looking for." The fence line between them went very quiet. A hawk crossed the sky above. Thomas looked at Margaret and felt something arrive in his chest he hadn't expected to feel again, not an echo of something old, but something entirely new, arriving without permission and without apology. The harvest social came at the end of the month. Margaret went. Thomas he hadn't been to a social since his wife passed, and he wasn't ready for that yet. And Margaret understood without needing it explained. Daniel was there, charming and attentive, and he danced well, which Margaret acknowledged was a genuine quality. He brought her something warm to drink and stood beside her with the easy comfort of a man who believed things were progressing in his favor. It was one of the older women in town who finally said it outright. "I hear you've been spending a great deal of time at the Callaway Ranch," she said to Margaret, in a tone that wasn't quite a question. "He's my neighbor," Margaret said. "Has been my whole life. He's also 55 years old. I say this because I wish you well." Daniel is standing 20 feet away. He's 28. His father owns half the supply contracts in the county. Margaret looked across the room at Daniel, genuinely 28, genuinely prosperous, genuinely suitable in every conventional sense. He caught her looking and smiled. She smiled back. Then she turned back to the older woman. "Do you know what Thomas did when my fence came down in the spring flood?" she said. "He was there the next morning with lumber he could barely spare. He never once mentioned it afterward." She paused. "That's not a small thing, that's the whole thing." She left the social early and rode home under a dark star-filled sky, thinking about what the whole thing actually meant once you finally saw it clearly. Daniel was everything the town wanted for her. Thomas was what she wanted for herself. She'd learned from watching the women in her own family choose carefully versus choose quickly that those two things were rarely the same, and that only one of them tended to last. This is the third lesson, and maybe the most useful one. There's a real difference between what looks good on paper and what's actually good for you. Approval from a crowd is not the same thing as compatibility. The loudest, most obvious choice is not always the right one, and the people cheering loudest for it usually aren't the ones who will be living with the consequences. Autumn deepened into the particular clarity that part of the country gets in late season. The trees went gold and then bare. The first snow touched the mountain peaks. The air took on that clean, uncompromising quality. Thomas had been quietly building something, not announcing it, not drawing attention to it. Margaret noticed the way she noticed everything about his place, gradually, across visits. The way you notice a garden growing. The porch railing he'd meant to fix for 2 years was fixed. A window frame in the kitchen had been replaced. The spare room, the one that had held his late wife's belongings, closed for 3 years, was open and aired out, the accumulated weight of it gently cleared away. She noticed all of it and said nothing. On a Thursday, not a Tuesday, which she noted, he knocked on her door. "I've been doing some work on the house," he said when she opened it. "I know," she said. "You noticed." "Thomas, I've been visiting that house for 3 years. I notice everything." He looked down at the hat he was turning over in his hands. "I want to ask you something, and I want to ask it properly." She waited. "Daniel is a good man," he said. "I know that. The whole town knows it. He's 28, he has good prospects, and there's every reasonable argument in his favor." He looked up. "I'm 55. I have a ranch that needs work, a porch I just fixed, and a kitchen window I replaced last week. I can't compete with reasonable arguments." "Then don't," she said. He looked at her. "I'd like to come calling on you," he said, plainly, "if you'll allow it." She looked at this man on her doorstep, hat in his hands, 55 years on his face, and a freshly mended porch railing waiting back home for him. "Thomas Calloway," she said, "I've been waiting for you to get here for about 3 years." He absorbed that for a moment. "I was thinking it through," he said. "I know," she said. "Come in. There's coffee." The town naturally had opinions about the development. One woman called it unexpected. Ruth called it romantic, and said so loudly. Daniel, to his credit, was gracious about the whole thing, which raised Margaret's opinion of him somewhat, and within the month he was courting a banker's daughter from the city, which raised it further still. The local minister thought the age gap was worth mentioning, and said so to Thomas directly, which took some nerve, and which Thomas respected even while disagreeing with it. "She's 25, the minister said. You're 55. In 20 years, Thomas said, I'll be 75. And in 20 years, she'll have had 20 years of someone who sees her clearly and means exactly what he says." He paused. "I think that's worth something." The minister thought about it, nodded once, and performed the ceremony a few months later without further comment. The courtship itself moved with the unhurried rhythm of two people who'd already known each other for years, and were simply admitting out loud what had quietly been true the whole time. No grand gestures, just suppers, conversations, and long rides through the autumn landscape along the creek that ran between their two properties. Margaret moved into the Calloway house the following spring, on a day when the last snow was melting off the peaks and the first green was showing in the lower fields. She brought her books, her mother's pie recipe, and a level of competence that visibly improved the ranch's accounts within the first month. Thomas watched her settle into the house the way water settles into its level naturally. Without announcement, completely, one evening that spring, she found him on the porch, looking at the mountains with the expression she'd come to recognize as his particular version of contentment. She sat beside him. "Are you happy?" she asked. Not anxiously, just honestly. He looked at the mountains a moment. "I'd stopped expecting to be," he said. "That's not the same as not being." He turned to her. "I'm happy," he said simply, plainly the way he said everything that actually mattered. She took his hand. The evening held them both. They married that winter in the town church, with the particular attendance of a community that had opinions about something and wanted to see how it resolved. Margaret wore a deep green dress, the color of the pines, because she'd never been a woman inclined to follow conventions that didn't suit her. Thomas wore his good jacket and stood at the front, watching her walk toward him, understanding with the full weight of his 55 years that some things arrive after you've stopped looking for them, and are no less real for having arrived late. The ranch became fully theirs, in the truest sense not his with her living in it, but genuinely shared. She kept the accounts, which improved considerably within the first quarter. He kept the cattle and the fences and the deep, decades-earned knowledge of the land. They divided the work by competence rather than convention, which meant Thomas sometimes cooked and Margaret sometimes repaired fence posts, and neither of them thought it remarkable. Their son arrived the following winter, a boy with his mother's red hair and his father's quiet, deliberate way of looking at things, which made him, from the very start, someone worth paying attention to. Thomas was 57 when his son was born. He'd worried about it beforehand, mentioned it to Margaret the careful way he mentioned things that genuinely concerned him. "Will I be enough?" he'd asked, not dramatically, just honestly. "You fixed a fence for me the morning after a flood," she said, without being asked, and never mentioned it again. She looked at him. "That's what a father does. You already know how." He didn't bring it up again. On a morning roughly 3 years after the pie and the joke and the conversation on the porch, Thomas was out at the north fence when he saw Margaret crossing the field, not carrying a pie this time, but their son on her hip, red-haired and serious-faced, watching the mountains with the expression of a child quietly filing the world away for later. She reached the fence. He opened the gate. She handed him the boy, who looked up at him with her sharp, direct, entirely unafraid eyes. Thomas held his son, looked at his wife, looked at the mountains doing exactly what they always did, and thought back to a Tuesday morning years earlier, a pie. A joke that hadn't been a joke at all, and a woman who'd looked at him with an expression he hadn't known how to read. He knew how to read it now. "If only I were 10 years younger," he said again, not as a joke this time, not as deflection, but as the simple acknowledgement of a man who understands exactly what he almost let slip away. Margaret looked at him with the same expression that had started everything. 10 years wouldn't have been enough," she said. "I needed exactly you. Exactly this." Their son looked between them with the serene incomprehension of a 1-year-old who wouldn't understand this story for many years, but would grow up living inside the warmth of it regardless. Thomas handed the boy back to his mother, closed the gate behind him, and walked across the field with his family in the morning light, grateful past all calculation, past every piece of arithmetic he'd once used against himself, that he'd made one small, foolish comment about a pie, and that the woman across the field had refused to let him take it back. Thomas Calloway nearly talked himself out of the best thing that ever happened to him. Not out of stubbornness, not out of pride, out of arithmetic. He counted his years and decided there were too many of them. He measured the distance between 55 and 25 and concluded that the gap disqualified him. He told himself he was being responsible. He told himself he was being realistic. He was, as Margaret might have put it with her usual dry patience, simply wrong. Age is real. It carries real weight and real consequences, and anyone who claims otherwise isn't paying close attention. Thomas knew that. Margaret knew that. Neither of them ever pretended it away. But Thomas had made one specific mistake. He'd confused the arithmetic of years with the arithmetic of worth. He'd counted a number and decided it meant he was too much of one thing and not enough of another. Margaret counted differently. She counted the man who showed up with lumber the morning after a flood, the man who said what he meant and meant what he said, the man who smiled rarely and meant it completely every single time. That isn't a man with too many years behind him. That's a man who spent 55 years quietly becoming exactly who he was. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes the person who sees that most clearly isn't the one doing the counting. It's the one who's been watching from across the field the whole time. So if there's one thing worth taking from this, and carrying into your own life, it's this. Don't let arithmetic talk you out of something real. Don't let a number on a calendar or a voice in town or a quiet fear dressed up as good sense convince you that what you have to offer isn't enough. It might be exactly enough. It might be precisely what someone has been waiting for, all along across a field on an ordinary Tuesday morning, holding something they made with their own two hands.